Hello, everyone. Welcome to Cyanide Awareness and Treatment for Medical Professionals. This course is designed to give kind of a higher level overview of cyanide poisoning, treatment, some of the things we have to be careful of and watch out for as we treat cyanide patients. This is meant for medical professionals. It's meant for people who are going to be caring for patients who are directly affected by cyanide toxicity. So a little bit about me. My name is James Warmoth. I'm a paramedic in the state of Texas. Been a paramedic since 2004. I am a Texas EMS instructor from 2007. Also a Texas firefighter since 2005. More importantly, I'm not an expert at anything. I do a lot of research and I look at and build classes that I find interesting. If you have any changes, corrections, comments, anything you'd like to add, you can email me. There's an email address right there, classes@the0-net.net. Please, if you are going to request changes or make comments, please let me know which class you're actually referring to. The intention with this is to put more and more classes as I have time to record them. So eventually there will be quite a back catalog of classes. One brief thing about licensing. So the class is licensed Creative Commons with the following modifiers: attribution, non-commercial, and share alike. Very briefly, what does that mean? You can take this class and you can share it to people. You can take this class and you can teach this class. You can take it and create a derivative work from this class. You could build your own class from the information provided in this class. There's only a couple of minor things that I ask for. The first of which is non-commercial. What does that mean? You do not turn around and sell the class that I'm offering you for free. Share alike, what that means is when you go to create a derivative work, you cannot license it more restrictive than what I have licensed it. And the last one is attribution. You have to show attribution to the original work. That could be through a link, that could be through works cited. It really doesn't matter to me all that much. This really is designed to allow people to take and use the class without people abusing the class, without people taking it and then creating a commercial class out of something that I've offered for free. This class is an original work, and because of that, one of the things that I very strongly believe in is showing my notes and showing my sources. This slide shows where I pulled information, how I got it, so that you can go back and look at those sources and make your own determinations about treatment and things like that. Again, I don't claim to be an expert in anything. These are places that I went to get information that I used to build this class. If you end up contributing information to this class, you'll be listed on here as well as a contributor to it. So the first thing that I want to go over is our knowledge objectives. The first one is to understand what cyanide is, how it's used in the production of nitriles, and the prevalence of cyanide in some products that you may not necessarily think have cyanide in them. Describe the different methods of exposure. Demonstrate the ability to use the emergency response guidebook. Understand how cyanide enters the body and how it kills. Understand the use of both major cyanide antidote kits, and review the protocol for hydrogen cyanide exposure. One thing I do want to mention here is we are looking at a general protocol for cyanide exposure. Your local protocols will most likely vary. And again, this isn't meant to replace training for your local protocols. This is meant to be just an overview of cyanide. One of the things that I like to do when I do classes in person is I like to ask questions. I like for the class to be a back and forth, not just a stand here and lecture while you listen type of thing. So I'm going to ask you some questions. I'm going to give you about 10 seconds to kind of formulate the answer. Feel free to pause the video if you need to take more time. The first question is, what is cyanide? What do you know about cyanide before entering this class? What are the different forms of cyanide? And how do you think someone could easily become exposed to cyanide? Again, I'm going to give you about 10 seconds here, and then we'll continue. All right, so what is cyanide? Cyanide can be a colorless gas such as hydrogen cyanide or cyanogen chloride. It can be a liquid, primarily when it's compressed from the gaseous form or dissolved in a liquid. It can be in a crystalline form such as sodium cyanide or potassium cyanide. It has a military designation, AC for hydrogen cyanide and CK for cyanogen chloride. Essentially, what is cyanide? It's a fast-acting and deadly poison that can exist in both solid, liquid, and gas form. How is cyanide used? Well, this is one of those things that can be very surprising. It's used very heavily in the chemical industry. It's present in chemicals used to develop photographs. It can be used in household silver polish and similar products. Cyanide gas is used to exterminate pests and vermin in ships and buildings. Cyanide salts are used in metallurgy for electroplating, metal cleaning, and removing gold from its ore. In manufacturing, cyanide is used to make paper, textiles, plastics. It's a common component in any and all nitriles that are produced. Nitrile medical gloves that you wear have cyanide bound somewhere in their chemical structure. Cyanide is one of those things that is extremely useful when it comes to the world of plastics and other polymers. Let's talk a little bit about exposure. Cyanide is released from natural substances in some foods and certain plants such as cassava, lima beans, and almonds. It's found in the pits and seeds of common fruits such as apricot, apples, peaches, and many have substantial amounts of chemicals which are metabolized into cyanide. So just because something doesn't directly contain cyanide doesn't mean that the body won't break it down into cyanide. If accidentally swallowed, chemicals found in acetonitrile-based products that are used to remove artificial nails can produce cyanide when metabolized by the body. But one of the big ones that is really being focused on right now is the combustion of products that have synthetic materials such as plastics, synthetic fibers, nylons, acrylics. And the real reason that that focus is being done now, it comes down to structure fires. And not only patients who are in closed space fires, but also first responders who are there trying to extinguish the fire. One of the things that I've seen throughout my career is the move from people fighting fire without air packs a lot of the time to almost always using air packs on the fire ground, even if you're not directly involved with interior operations. Because as the synthetic fibers have made their way into houses more and more, we see toxic gases being produced by those structure fires. It's not uncommon to see people who never went interior but weren't wearing air packs suffering from cyanide exposure, as those plastics, nitriles, and other things have broken down and released cyanide or phosgene or other components that are now poisoning our patients and our first responders. Cyanide is also contained in cigarette smoke. Just put that out there. Smoking has become far less prevalent nowadays than it used to be. But again, it is still there. It's just something to mention. The big thing that I really want to focus on is the industrial aspect of it, and also the closed space structure fires. Those are where our two largest exposures are going to be coming from in EMS, at least modern EMS. So nitriles and the link to cyanide. And this is one of those things I really didn't understand until I started doing the research. A nitrile is a specific chemical function group. We have a carbon, we have a nitrogen, we have a triple bond. A nitrile is an organic compound that has that functional group in it. The prefix cyano is used interchangeably with the term nitrile in industrial literature. What does that really say? Well, anything that contains the prefix cyano or nitrile or tril as its suffix tells us that it contains cyanide bound somewhere in its chemical structure. Nitriles are found in many useful compounds, including cyanoacrylate, which is superglue, nitrile rubbers, nitrile-containing polymers used in latex-free medical gloves. Nitrile rubber is widely used as a seal since it's resistant to fuel and oils. And one of the things I really want you to take away from this slide is how many things around you, if you really look at them, how many of those things around you possibly contain cyanide somewhere in its chemical structure? Again, cyanide is used very heavily in industry, especially in plastics, nitriles, and other polymers. So here is a critical concept. We are exposed to low levels of cyanide every single day, from vehicle exhaust, secondhand smoking. Many of the fruits that we eat contain low levels of cyanide. So that means that the human body must have a way of detoxifying and dealing with cyanide. And in fact, it does. It's one of the things that we'll be talking about. Where we have to get involved, like in most cases, is when the amount of cyanide exceeds the body's ability to process it. And one of the things that you'll see is one of our antidote kits is based very heavily on how the body naturally detoxifies cyanide. Okay, so question for you. How hard is it for someone to get their hands on cyanide? Do you think it's possible for the average person to make it in their backyard using chemicals easily available? I'm going to give you 10 seconds to think about that. If you're watching this video on YouTube, there won't be a video here in this section. YouTube tends to take down fairly quickly the video that I want to show you, but it's been uploaded enough that you shouldn't have any trouble finding someone who's putting it up. And it's a video of someone making sodium cyanide in their backyard using things that they got from the local hardware store and Amazon. And they successfully make sodium cyanide using things that they were easily able to get a hold of. If you're not watching this class on YouTube, I've got the video which I'll insert here. The next thing that I want to talk about is the emergency response guidebook. Obviously, this cover picture is a little bit old. The picture doesn't really matter. Do you know where the emergency response guidebook is located in your apparatus? Do you know how to use it? Do you know what to do if you only know the name of a substance? Do you know what to do if you only have a placard number? The emergency response guidebook is extremely useful at grouping chemicals together into guide pages that give you very basic treatment and management instructions for both fire, EMS, and isolation distances. Let's do an exercise. I want you to go grab your emergency response guidebook and let's look up hydrogen cyanide. It's ID number 1051. Chemical name is hydrogen cyanide. However you look it up, it should lead you to guide page 117. Let's take a look at guide page 117 and see what it has to offer us. Here is guide page 117. One of the first things that we see at the very top: gases, toxic, flammable, extreme hazard. And again, if we look at those key points, what state is it in? It's a gas. Flammability, it's flammable. Danger, it's extremely hazardous. That should automatically give you some reservations about this chemical. The fact that it has the extreme hazard designation should really give you some opportunity to take pause and realize that this isn't something we probably want to be messing with. Let's take a look at guide page 117 and see what it has to offer. The first thing that we see at the very top is gases, toxic, flammable, but then directly underneath that, extreme hazard. And the words extreme hazard should give you pause. They don't use that terminology very often, and usually when they do, it's because they mean it. Moving further down, it says, do not extinguish a leaking gas fire unless the leak can be stopped. Now, why is that? That doesn't make sense. If we put the fire out, at least it's not on fire anymore, right? Well, one of the big things is that sometimes the byproducts of combustion are less dangerous than the actual product itself. So in this case, if cyanide is burning, we're breaking that cyanide down through thermal into something less toxic. By putting out the fire, we've created a more toxic environment because we're no longer breaking it down. One of the key things that I like to point out here, and it goes again with that extreme hazard marker, it says fight fire from maximum distance or use unmanned hoses or monitor nozzles. Again, you don't want to be anywhere near this stuff in any way. Let's move down to first aid, and let's look at some of the key points there. First off, always take appropriate PPE. Move our victim to fresh air. Getting our victim out of that environment and into an environment that isn't actively trying to kill them is fantastic. Don't give mouth-to-mouth ventilations because of the possibility of cross-contamination. Remember that a patient may continue to off-gas cyanide post-exposure, leading to a rescuer becoming a victim. We see this especially in ingestion cases, where a patient may ingest a liquid or solid form of cyanide and then begin to vomit, which then causes new cyanide to be released through the vomitus. Remove and isolate contaminated clothing. Once it is absorbed into clothing, it can continue to cause exposure. So again, we need to remove, isolate that clothing, make sure we're not in the same room as that clothing because it will continue to potentially off-gas. Decontaminate the patient with running water for at least 20 minutes. One of the big things that I see that just doesn't get done is proper decontamination. You really need a sufficient amount of time and water to make sure that cyanide is off the patient. That 20-minute mark is important. The effects of exposure can be delayed, especially when we're looking at an ingestion route, because it can take a while for that cyanide to be taken up into the bloodstream. Moving on to page 2, again, some key points here. Toxic, extreme hazard, we already saw that, but now it's bold under health. It has an irritating odor, but deadens the sense of smell, leading to olfactory fatigue. What that essentially means is not everyone can smell cyanide. A lot of people describe it as bitter almonds, but the truth is, studies have shown that only about 50% of the population can actually smell cyanide. And once you've been around it for a while, you get olfactory fatigue and you can't smell it anymore. One of the things that a lot of chemical plants used to do was something called a sniff test, where they would put a very small amount of cyanide under a hood and see if you could smell it. This was good to know that you could smell cyanide. It also meant that you were intentionally exposing your employees to cyanide. So it was stopped, at least in most places, in a modern plant setting. We don't like to knowingly expose our patients just to see if they can smell it. Protective clothing. Now, this is a section that I tend to harp on. The only appropriate PPE when you do not know the concentration of cyanide is level A, fully encapsulated suit with self-contained breathing air. That is the minimum PPE. If you don't know anything else except there's cyanide out there, cyanide can absorb through unbroken skin at high enough concentrations. Fully encapsulated suit, level A suit with self-contained breathing air is the only appropriate PPE when you do not know the concentration of cyanide. Remember that structural fire gear does not provide sufficient protection from chemical exposure. That will not protect you. You need to be wearing an encapsulated suit. Let's go ahead and look at some general properties of cyanide. So again, we kind of talked about some of this already, but I really want to stress them. So states of matter, it can be a solid, a liquid, or a gas. We already talked about that liquids are typically either gases that have been compressed, or we're dealing with cyanide that has been dissolved in a liquid. We have solid forms, typically salt forms. We talked about sodium cyanide, potassium cyanide. And then we have gases like hydrogen cyanide. Boiling point, 80 degrees Fahrenheit. It's explosive and flammable. It's water soluble. It's toxic and corrosive. It's lighter than air. It's 94% as dense as air, which means it will rise, but it will rise slowly. The IDLH is 10 part per million. Now that is a number that I think is really important. And the human brain has a difficult time discerning very small and very large numbers. And so one of the things I like to use to kind of describe that is, imagine you have a stadium with 1 million people. If 10 of those people in that sea of 1 million are cyanide, that is your IDLH. Now, IDLH, what does that really mean? That's kind of a strange little acronym there. It means immediately dangerous to life and health. Does that mean at 10 part per million you're going to fall over and die right now? Well, generally no. We'll look at it. We'll look at the actual textbook definition of it here in just a moment. But the definition that I like to use is if your protective gear fails at 10 part per million, you may not be able to exit that environment without sufficient harm coming to you. Our actual definition of cyanide is likely to cause death, immediate or delayed, permanent adverse health effects, and prevent escape from such an environment. Again, I don't like that definition. There's lots of slashes and things like that in it. I like mine better. If your PPE fails, you may not be able to exit that environment before serious harm occurs. Remember that at high enough concentrations, cyanide can absorb through unbroken skin. It can be absorbed by any route of exposure, which is one of the reasons why it's so dangerous. I would like to talk about some exposure concentrations. One of the things that I want to make sure that I point out as many times as possible throughout this class is since cyanide can enter the body through unbroken skin if concentrations are high enough, unless the specific concentration is known, a fully encapsulated chemical resistant suit with self-contained breathing air is the only appropriate PPE, what we call a level A suit. Although a great many deaths have occurred from accidental, intentional, or occupational exposure to hydrogen cyanide, in only a few cases are the specific exposure concentrations known. Now, why do you think that is? Let's just take that little sentence and unpack it for a minute. A great many deaths have occurred, but we don't really know the concentration. Well, a lot of times it was too dangerous to approach that patient to do anything for them until the concentrations dropped. We do have some numbers, though, that can kind of help us figure things out. The average fatal concentrations for humans is estimated, keyword estimated, at around 546 part per million for 10 minutes. Exposure to airborne concentrations of 180 to 270 parts per million were fatal within several minutes, and a concentration of 135 parts per million was fatal within 30 minutes. So we've got 540, 10 minutes, that's the average fatal. But then also we have these other numbers, 180 to 270 were fatal, usually within several minutes. Again, this goes back to this idea that when these concentrations get really high, it's too dangerous to get to the patient to do any kind of measurements to see what levels they're at. And again, some of these numbers come from the US military, where again, it was used as a chemical agent, so they've got some numbers, and we don't want to know how they got those numbers, but they got them. The key thing to remember here is at high concentrations, it was too dangerous to go in and get numbers to really figure out how much they were exposed to. A question that I have for you is, how does cyanide cause harm in the body? Again, I'm going to give you about 10 seconds to think about that, and then we'll proceed. This is my little diagram of how cyanide kills. And we're going to go into each and every one of these little spots and talk about each individual process. So first off, cyanide enters the body. It locks onto the hemoglobin for transport, then locks onto the mitochondria, stops cellular respiration. Oxygen and glucose can no longer fuel the cell. The patient essentially suffocates at the cellular level. And again, we're going to go into this and look at each level as we proceed forward. So let's go back to the beginning and take a look at this chart. So cyanide enters the body through any exposure route and is drawn to the bloodstream. When we get to the bloodstream, cyanide really likes metals, and so it finds the iron 2, the ferrous, in the hemigroups of the red blood cells and binds with them to form cyanomethemoglobin, which can't carry oxygen, but the bond that it has is relatively unstable. It's happy there, but there's a better place it would prefer to bind to. The hemoglobin becomes a transport mechanism for the cyanide to get deeper into the body. Cyanide floats through the bloodstream, carried by the Fe2, until it finds cytochrome oxidase in the mitochondria, which contains Fe3, the ferric. Cyanide likes Fe3 slightly more and jumps to it, but it forms a stable bond. What this does is it essentially shuts down the mitochondria of the cell. The cell can no longer take in oxygen and glucose and produce ATP and carbon dioxide. So what we're left with is a power plant that has been completely shut down. As a result, cellularly, the patient begins to suffocate with oxygen right inside the bloodstream, but it can't get into the cells. The cyanide anion is an inhibitor of the enzyme cytochrome C oxidase in the fourth complex of the electron transport chain. It attaches to the iron within this protein. The binding of cyanide to this enzyme prevents the transport of electrons from cytochrome C oxidase to oxygen. As a result, the electron transport chain is disrupted, meaning that the cell can no longer aerobically produce ATP for energy. The patient essentially suffocates at the cellular level. In short, cyanide gets into the body and forms a stable bond which prevents the powerhouse of the cell from producing power. Another question for you. What are these signs and symptoms of cyanide exposure? Do you know how you would recognize cyanide exposure in a patient? I'm going to give you 10 seconds to think about that, and we'll move forward. Here are some general symptoms of cyanide exposure. Keep in mind that depending on the concentration, they may not necessarily exhibit all of these signs and symptoms. Again, this is really just a collection of things that have been seen. We have things like weakness, confusion, passing out, seizures, nausea, headache, cardiac arrest, cardiac dysrhythmia, difficulty breathing, gasping for air, flushed appearance, and respiratory arrest. One of the ones that I really want to talk about here, because it's one of our key indicators of cyanide exposure, is that flushed appearance. When we say their skin is essentially like cherry red. Why is their skin red? Again, the whole idea is that they are actively suffocating at the cellular level. So what's really going on here? Well, essentially, there's oxygen in the blood. There's oxygen getting to the capillary beds. In fact, there's an overabundance of oxygen because it's no longer being used by the body. So that patient is going to have that nice pink red appearance, but they're still actively dying due to the failure of cellular respiration. Let's talk a little bit about natural detoxification. As we previously discussed, cyanide occurs naturally in the environment, and exposure to cyanide in very small quantities is normal. So Cyanide is metabolized in the liver into thiocyanate, which is 1/100th the toxicity of cyanide, but is still toxic. Thiocyanate is naturally removed by the kidneys and released from the body in the urine. Keep in mind, the patient may continue to off-gas cyanide through breath, vomit, and skin throughout the detoxification process. The key thing here is the body does have a way to detoxify it, and this process does work when the concentrations are low, when the exposures are small. One of the things that you'll see in the standardized treatment regimen for cyanide is that if the exposure is low enough, we let the body do its job. The only time that we really step in is when the body can no longer detoxify it fast enough, and we need to provide additional assistance. Question for you. What are the general first aid guidelines for cyanide exposure? Looking at general first aid goals. First aid goals focus on termination of the exposure and rapid decontamination. Most first aid goals recommend high flow oxygen. Kind of a question there. If the patient doesn't have a problem with oxygen, they have a problem with cellular respiration, why are we giving oxygen? Well, while the problem isn't a lack of oxygen, this will help ensure that the maximum oxygen is available to the body as cyanide releases. The first priority is scene safety, followed by termination of the exposure, and then decontamination. Let's stop the exposure from happening, and let's begin the process of getting the patient into a recovery state. Moving into one of our antidote kits. The first one we're going to talk about is the Nathiadote kit. The Nathiadote kit is an older kit. It uses amyl nitrite, which oxidizes the Fe2 in the hemoglobin to Fe3. This attracts the cyanide from the cell to rebind with the methemoglobin. Doing this allows the cell to once again use oxygen and produce ATP. However, methemoglobin cannot carry oxygen. You have to balance the amount of hemoglobin and methemoglobin that you produce in the body to ensure that the body can still carry oxygen and the cells are able to use it. Sodium nitrite performs the same goal as amyl nitrite, but it does so through IV and adds sodium, which is another metal. Sodium thiosulfate converts your cyanide into thiocyanate and sulfite. Now, you may notice the word thiocyanate. We've seen that before, right? Nathiadote's big claim to fame is it doesn't do anything that the body doesn't already do naturally. It just does it at concentrations where the human body can't. One of the things that we're doing here with this kit, and I don't mean to bash on the kit, but I want you to understand what you're doing here. We have cyanide that is actively bound to the cytochrome oxidase. It's bound to the mitochondria. We are converting oxygen-carrying hemoglobin to a form that is non-oxygen carrying to attract the cyanide off the cell. The idea is once the cyanide releases from the cell can start using oxygen again. And so we have now transformed that red blood cell from oxygen carrying capacity to cyanide carrying capacity. So we have to reach a balance in the body. We can't convert all of their hemoglobin into methemoglobin because then they can't carry oxygen. We're going to kill them just as quickly as the cyanide would. We have to find that balance in the body between methemoglobin and hemoglobin, allowing the cells to breathe, to take in oxygen, and produce ATP. This kit works, but there's a lot of caveats. If you know anything about nitrites, you know that they have a very profound impact on blood pressure. So we are also going to be trading some amount of perfusion for this treatment. One of the reasons that it has come under fire in recent years, at least at the time of this recording, is we have some better options. Some options that don't take away oxygen carrying capacity of the patient, that don't drop the patient's blood pressure, that don't convert cyanide into thiocyanate, which is less toxic than cyanide, but still toxic. Again, this kit does exist. It is a good kit. It just has some very significant limitations when you look at something of a much more modern standard. The next treatment kit that I want to talk about is the cyano kit. Now, one of the things that you'll see here, the cyano kit calls out, or at least my slide for the cyano kit calls out amyl nitrite. Keep in mind that amyl nitrite is not part of the cyano kit. The reason that I put it here is because many industrial facilities, even with the cyano kit, like to have amyl nitrite. Amyl nitrite, remember, it allows the body to trade oxygen carrying capacity in the bloodstream for cyanide carrying capacity. So while you're trying to get that IV, while you're trying to get everything established to administer the cyano kit, amyl nitrite is a viable stalling option for you. It allows us to commit a certain amount of hemoglobin to carrying cyanide and let the cells begin to start breathing while we get the kit ready. It is in no way needed for hydroxycobalamin to do its job. Let's talk now about the cyano kit itself, hydroxycobalamin. Hydroxycobalamin has been around in the US for a while, but it's been in relatively low concentrations. One of the things that it was used for in the United States was hydroxycobalamin is a precursor to vitamin B12. So a lot of times patients with vitamin B12 deficiency would get hydroxycobalamin, and then their body would convert it into vitamin B12. Because again, we're exposed to low levels of cyanide in everything that we do, from automobile exhaust to chemical plants being around us, food that we eat. So there's always a little bit available that we can convert. We started seeing higher concentrations of it being used in Europe, where they were doing studies on closed space fires, and it was discovered that it works remarkably well because more and more our homes are being built with the nitriles, the plastics, the polymers that when they are consumed by fire produce cyanide as a byproduct. Hydroxycobalamin does not interfere with oxygen carrying capacity of the blood, and because of that, it may be considered a superior therapy compared to nitriles, which have the bad habit of dropping blood pressure and removing some oxygen carrying capacity. It takes at least 5 grams of hydroxycobalamin administered intravenously over 10 minutes to neutralize a lethal dose of cyanide in an adult. It doesn't cause hypotension or methemoglobin anemia, and therefore may be reasonably given to victims before confirming cyanide exposure. Something that I really want to drive home here is the Thiadote kit is meant for, we know you have cyanide exposure, right? We are doing some nasty things to your body in the hopes of saving you. Hydroxycobalamin is a far less dangerous approach. It's a far less risky approach. We are going to give you a chemical that wants to bind with cyanide. That's its happy state, is when it's bound to cyanide. And the idea is that we can do that without modifying your oxygen carrying capacity, without modifying your blood pressure and things like that. There's a line in here that says this is especially important in cases of possible carbon monoxide intoxication. One of the things that we have to be very careful with, we talked about the fact that we can, through amyl nitrite and sodium nitrite, we are converting oxygen carrying capacity into cyanide carrying capacity in the red blood cells. Well, remember, we have to strike a balance. What happens if there's already carbon monoxide on the cell? Now we have three parties that we have to keep track of, because carbon monoxide doesn't allow oxygen transfer. It binds to the hemoglobin, prevents oxygen transfer. Then we also have red blood cells that we're converting to carry cyanide instead of oxygen. So we have to be very careful when we start playing with patients' oxygen carrying capacity. Hydroxycobalamin is a really amazing drug. I really like it. It is vitamin B12 minus one key ingredient, one important thing, and that is cyanide. Because cyanocobalamin is vitamin B12. With the cyano kit, we have taken one of the most deadly poisons on the planet and turned it into vitamin B12. That's one of the reasons that I particularly like this kit. Again, I don't mean to bash on the thiadote. It is a good kit, but we have better options now. We have less dangerous options. Moving into the standard cyanide protocol, we're going to assess the airway, breathing, and circulation. If indicated, expose the patient, then recover the patient to assure retention of body heat. Remember that clothing can continue to cause re-exposure. That's why that's there. Assess vital signs, including temperature and pulse oximetry, which may not correlate with tissue oxygenation in cyanide and smoke exposure. We've kind of talked about that already to a limited degree, but essentially a standard pulse ox cannot tell the difference between carbon monoxide and oxygen. We need something called a rainbow sensor, and we're going to talk more about that rainbow sensor a little bit later on. But that's something to keep in mind, is the fact that your SpO2 numbers may not be correct. Attach a cardiac monitor and examine the rhythm strip for arrhythmias. Perform that 12 lead, get glucose, monitor pulse oximetry and EtCO2. Monitor the patient for signs of hypoxia and respiratory decompensation, regardless of the pulse oximetry readings. Identify the specific agent of exposure, the time of ingestion or inhalation, and the quantity or the time of exposure. Obtain patient history. Perform a physical exam. One comment of note here is that there is no widely available rapid confirmatory cyanide blood test. Many hospitals will not be able to rapidly assess cyanide levels. Therefore, treatment decisions must be made on the basis of clinical history and the signs and symptoms of cyanide intoxication. Treatment interventions. For the patients with an appropriate history and manifesting one or more significant cyanide exposure signs and symptoms, treat with 100% oxygen via non-rebreather mask or bag valve mask. Collect pre-treatment blood samples in the appropriate tubes for lactate and cyanide levels. Again, this assumes that your service is allowed to do that. This is just a standard protocol. And there may be some things missing here that your service does do. This is meant to be a one-size-fits-all, which doesn't really work all that well. Administer one of the following drug regimens: the hydroxycobalamin, which is preferred, or the thiadote kit. The hydroxycobalamin is also called the cyano kit. That brings us to the end of the lecture slides. There's a couple of things that I want to reiterate to you before I step away. The first thing is I want you to come away with an understanding of how prevalent cyanide truly is. It's used very heavily in industry and in insufficient quantities to cause significant loss of life, but also in many products that you don't even think about. Those nitriles, those products that have cyano in their name, anything with that trill designation, they all have cyanide bound in their chemical structure. It's a common component in our nitriles, our plastics, our other polymers. And when they thermally decompose or chemically decompose, they can release cyanide back into the environment, and you can easily be overcome. Remember that at high enough concentrations, it can absorb through unbroken skin. It can absorb through mucous membranes. They're really, you need protective clothing to be around this chemical. There have been several cases where people were going through their grandfather's barn and found an unmarked can, and they opened it up and it had a chunk of something of a white solid. And it turned out that it was sodium cyanide because it was used heavily for extermination of rodents and things like that. There have been cases where people have gone into ship holds and did not realize that fumigation was going on and it was being used to kill pests and things like that. There was a particular case where in an area where I live where a railroad company was refurbishing rail cars, and they received a rail car that had at one point had cyanide in it, and they were doing an inspection on this rail car, which they had purged with nitrogen and things like that, but there was enough cyanide that was essentially bonded to the walls of the tank that after the nitrogen purge, they were still exposed to significant amounts of cyanide to make them ill. Remember that the body does have the ability to naturally detoxify cyanide. We are exposed to it every day, from car exhaust to fruits that we eat, but the body can only detoxify so much of it at a time before the body becomes overwhelmed. And when the body does become overwhelmed, that's when we need to step in with one of our kits. The thiadote kit is a good kit. It's an older kit. It carries with it some specific issues where it can cause problems with blood pressure. It causes modification of your body's ability to transport oxygen. And it converts cyanide into a less toxic but still toxic substance. Again, it's the way the body naturally does it, but we're talking about very small amounts versus very large amounts. The hydroxycobalamin, the cyano kit, is a superior kit in many ways. It doesn't mess with blood pressure, doesn't mess with oxygen carrying capacity. You can give it in a suspected scenario versus a confirmed scenario. If you happen to give hydroxycobalamin to a patient who doesn't have cyanide exposure, they're going to have dark red colored urine, and there may be some tissue staining red at the site of administration. But ultimately, there will be no lasting harm. The thiadote kit, while you could argue there is no lasting harm, it can cause blood pressure issues, and it can cause oxygen carrying issues in a temporary form, whereas you don't see that in the hydroxycobalamin camp. I tend to be very pro hydroxycobalamin, but I like to present both. I know that there are many plants that swear by nathiadote, and that's fine. They have experience with it, it works. There's just some caveats that we have to remember with that. Ultimately, cyanide is a part of our world, it's something that we are exposed to. And it's important that when we have a patient who's exposed to it, we know what to do and how to treat it. Remember that this patient is like any other patient. We need to manage airway, breathing, and circulation. We need to make sure that if they're not breathing, we start breathing for them. If they don't have a pulse, we start a pulse for them through mechanical CPR. Just like we talk about when we say cold water drownings, a person isn't dead until they're warm and dead. Well, a person isn't dead from cyanide until you've worked CPR and given an entire antidote kit. Does that mean that you will get them back? No, there's no guarantee of that. But they're not dead until they've received that antidote kit. Cyanide can be a scary thing. It's a very fast killer. One of the things that I like to tell people is when they were doing gas chamber executions, a lot of the times it was a sodium cyanide pellet that was held over a small dish of acid. And when that sodium cyanide pellet was dropped on command into the acid, it rapidly vaporized into a cyanide gas, which is how the gas chamber worked. It was used as a method of execution, and it was effective. So this is one of those chemicals that we shouldn't take lightly. We need to respect, and we need to know what we need to do and how we need to do it, because time is essential when it comes to administering these medications. I hope you've enjoyed this class. I hope that it has helped you in some way. And remember that I have my contact information at the beginning. If you have any suggestions, comments, corrections, anything you think needs to be added, please send me an email. Let me know. I do upgrade and update the online versions of these classes over time to keep them relevant. I think that's it for now, but I thank you for staying with me. I thank you for watching this training, and I hope you have a good rest of the day.